Last, there's bias blind spot, which this I'm pretty sure all of us at one point of time have been guilty of, and this is also called the not me fallacy. This is when you pretty much you're biased towards yourself and you believe, okay, I'm not biased, so none of this applies to me. I don't have to take any of this into consideration, but it's always easier to see other people's biases. It's easier to focus on their biases because we're more prone to view ourselves more positively than we do others. And if we think, okay, somebody disagrees with me, they're wrong, they haven't done the research, this can be a bias blind spot at times. We're all prone to biases when it comes to evaluating and processing our information. So this is why it is so important as professionals that we look for these commonplace cognitive errors and often.
Science versus pseudoscience. 10 warning signs. According to Hines, 2003, and Lilienfeld, Lil, and Lohr, 2003, pseudosciences can be defined as disciplines that display the superficial appearance of science but lack its substance. As a consequence, they can even fool highly intelligent and well-trained individuals. According to Aber, 2003, acceptance of pseudoscientific claims results from not being aware of their most common characteristics. Science and pseudoscience differ in degree rather than in kind, which means it is unlikely that one necessary and sufficient criterion can distinguish science from pseudoscience. The more warning signs a claim exhibits, the more skeptical of it we should be. Lilienfeld, Ammariti, and David, 2011, discuss 10 warning signs of pseudoscience that school psychologists should be aware of when evaluating claims. Warning sign number 1. Lack of falsifiability and overuse of ad hoc hypotheses. Philosopher of science Sir Karl Popper, 1959, defined falsifiability as the ability to disprove a theory using evidence. Falsifiability is a key characteristic of science, whereas unfalsifiability is a key characteristic of pseudoscience. Lilienfeld and colleagues, 2011, used Popper's 1959 critique of Freud and Adler's personality theories as evidence to support their first point. Freud and Adler's personality theories are unfalsifiable because they remain stable in almost any type of situation. Scientific theories must not only predict certain outcomes, they must prohibit other outcomes. Otherwise, they would essentially explain nothing at all. Theories can also be made falsifiable by an overabundance of ad hoc hypotheses. An ad hoc hypothesis is essentially a loophole used to discredit negative findings that challenge the original hypothesis. Lilienfeld and colleagues 2011 provided examples of ad hoc hypotheses including inappropriateness of tasks for the population, not rigorous enough diagnoses, small sample size, and comparison groups which inadvertently have a mild version of the variable being studied. Lilienfeld and colleagues 2011 do, however, point out that one or more of these ad hoc hypotheses may even be correct. In science, ad hoc hypotheses can strengthen a theory's content, predictive power, or both. In pseudoscience, however, ad hoc hypotheses save claims from falsification, which in turn places a theory outside the range of influence of scientific testing. Some proponents of theories have a tendency to shift the bar for evidence depending on whether it supports or disconfirms one's hypotheses, which Mill, 1974, referred to as, quote, a double standard of evidential morals, end quote. Warning sign number 2. Lack of self-correction. Scientific claims tend to self-correct over time because scientific knowledge is always open to revision pending new data. Pseudoscience claims, however, tend to be stable over time, even in the face of repeated contrary evidence. To support their second point, Lilienfeld and colleagues 2011 discuss evidence for the invalidity of the, quote, matching hypothesis. The idea of matching students' learning styles to teachers' teaching styles. Although the matching hypothesis may seem intuitive, Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 contradict this belief with Tarver and Dawson's 1978 conclusion that modality preference and method of teaching reading do not interact significantly. Due to the wealth of evidence contradicting the matching hypothesis, Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 suggests that students and teachers make measures to use educational techniques that are grounded in more solid scientific research. Warning sign number 3. Emphasis on confirmation. Confirmation bias can lead us to seek out evidence that is consistent with our hypotheses and to ignore or selectively reinterpret evidence that is not. Science incorporates systematic safeguards against confirmation bias, such as randomized control designs, whereas pseudoscience tends to ignore safeguards. In pseudoscience, the emphasis is on confirmation rather than refutation. Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 used the Total Transformation Program as an example of how pseudoscience uses feedback to prove the product's effectiveness rather than improve the product. Even if the Total Transformation Program was highly effective, it is unlikely it would work for everyone, but the website provides numerous quotes and reviews without mention that the program may not work for all children. Warning sign number 4. Evasion of peer review. The peer review process provides some protection from poor quality research through review by 3 or more independent and anonymous scholars. In pseudoscience, however, the claims are disseminated and promoted before they have been subjected to expert scrutiny. Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 used the Bryan Gym as an example of research that has escaped scrutiny. In their review of the literature, Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 found that Hyatt, 2007, identified only 5 peer-reviewed articles for Bryan Gym, one in which the author was a participant, and 3 others were published in the same journal that requires payment for publication. Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 advised that if one does not possess the expertise or resources to conduct studies on a program's effectiveness, then one should wait for studies before promoting the program to parents, teachers, and others. Warning sign number 5. Over-reliance on anecdotal and testimonial evidence. Multiple pieces of anecdotal evidence are rarely, if ever, enough to determine that a claim is valid. Anecdotes are often difficult to verify, are of unclear or questionable representativeness, and are vulnerable to multiple competing explanations. If a treatment is efficacious, one should expect to hear anecdotal claims of its effectiveness, but only controlled studies that have been replicated by independent scholars can allow one to actually make a conclusion about efficacy. Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 used the Scared Straight program as evidence of over-reliance on anecdotal and testimonial evidence. The Scared Straight programs are not only ineffective in reducing crime rates among adolescents, but also significantly increase the risk of offending among adolescents. Warning sign number 6. Absence of connectivity. Connectivity can be defined as the extent to which claims build on or connect with other claims. In science, novel claims draw on well-established findings, whereas in pseudoscience, new paradigms are often constructed out of thin air. To support their 6th point, Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 used the example of the myth of left brain versus right brain learners. Differences between these 2 groups are not mutually exclusive because both hemispheres are in virtually continuous interaction and are more similar than different in their information processing. Believers in this myth, however, remain disconnected from scientific literature and can influence how student learning and activities are structured. Warning sign number 7. Extraordinary claims. An extraordinary claim is one that runs counter to virtually all existing knowledge. In order to argue for an extraordinary claim, one must have extraordinary evidence, according to Truzzi, 1978, and Sagan, 1995. Lilienfeld and colleagues' 2011 used the example of indigo children as an extraordinary claim without evidence. Although claims about indigo children are expansive and purport that these children are privileged to information beyond most people's comprehension, there is no convincing evidence that humans born in the last few decades are special. Warning sign number 8, ad antiquatem fallacy. The ad antiquatem fallacy is the error of appealing to the antiquity of claims as a means of supporting their legitimacy. In other words, it is tempting to assume that if a practice has been around for a long time, that there is a reason why. Lilienfeld and colleagues, 2011, used the example of the use of projected methods in school psychology, such as draw person and Rorschach ink blot tests, to support their claim that tradition should not be confused with validation. The training we receive can highly influence our choice of assessment methods, and institutional inertia, or the tendency of long-standing clinical traditions to change slowly, causes these choices to become simple habit. Warning sign number 9, use of hyper-technical language. Scientists often introduce new and distinct terminology in order to differentiate among concepts that are superficially similar. Promoters of pseudoscience, however, rely on overly technical language to establish legitimacy for their invalid practices that implement unsupported techniques. Lilienfeld and colleagues, 2011, provide auditory integration training, AIT, as an example of a program that uses language lacking in precision and meaning. Research has yielded negative evidence for the effectiveness of AIT for autism spectrum disorders, and although it may sound legitimate, AIT is vague and lacks clear-cut scientific references. Warning sign number 10, absence of boundary conditions. Boundary conditions are situations in which the claims associated with a theory are and are not valid and appropriate. In pseudoscience, claims operate across a wide range of conditions, and the treatment applies to virtually all conditions or everyone. As evidence of absent boundary conditions, Lilienfeld and colleagues, 2011, point to the Erlen method, which supposedly helps individuals suffering from reading and learning problems, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, behavioral and emotional disorders, somatic complaints, phobias, traumatic brain injury, and other medical conditions. As a cure-all treatment for virtually all disordered individuals, Erlen's method lacks boundary conditions. Overall, Lilienfeld and colleagues, 2011, provide many examples of research that demonstrate warning signs of pseudoscience. They do not, however, discuss the difference between clinical and statistical significance in research. If research does not have statistical significance but has a large effect size, then the research could make a meaningful difference in the lives of individuals, although statistically, the research results could be due to chance. Conversely, if research has statistical significance but no effect, then the research results are not due to chance, but the research will not make a difference in the lives of individuals. It is important to recognize as school psychologists, teachers, and counselors that we should first and foremost do no harm, and second, use evidence-based practices and avoid these warning signs to ensure that we are making as meaningful a difference in the lives of students as we can.
The article puts much emphasis on pseudoscientific practices and claims. It's important as change agents, school psychologists, and educators not to engage in practices not supported by empirical findings. We should be mindful that our decisions as professionals affects others. Relaying or making decisions based on data without scientific support can be harmful and have a negative impact on others, especially those we are inspiring to help. A way of minimizing these errors is through graduate school training programs, teaching the evolution of school psychology and evidence-based interventions to focus on problem solving rather than popularity, instilling skepticism in upcoming school psychologists and graduate students to avoid gullibility, and create a demand for evidence to support claims. The ultimate goal is to benefit the child. An effective, valid intervention that refrains from pseudoscience is the best option in assistance for the child.